Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to be here. I'm Victoria Taylor. I work in the WeWork digital department, and I'm so excited that we have Jake Knapp joining us today.
Thank you.
Oh, I think you have to poke the button on the side. Yeah, there you go.
The button that says push.
And I'm super, super excited that we get to discuss his new book, Sprint, which I believe is coming out in early March.
Yeah, super soon, March 8th.
And so tell us a little bit about yourself. You came up with this process, right?
Yeah, I came up with this process while working at Google, and I was looking for a way to do my own work and to help the teams that I was working with do their work more efficiently. And so we started experimenting with group brainstorms, which eventually found didn't work, and then went on to this what became this process. And so for the past few years, I've been doing this at Google Ventures, which is now called GV.
And so one of the things that's really cool about Sprint is that you bring in real-world case studies of the ways that you use the Sprint process. So a little bit about it. Basically, what Jake came up with was a system of allowing you to go from a problem to a solution, being able to test that solution and actually gauge the feedback in 5 days, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's actually kind of surprising to me how much you can do in 5 days and how well it works across different kinds of products. So it works if you're doing sort of a consumer website, and maybe that's obvious, but it also works for robotics and healthcare. The deadline, as many of you, if any of you are procrastinators like me, you might know that a deadline will suddenly make you magically productive, and that's a big part of what works so well in the sprint.
And I think that's something that people will like about the book is that you have a variety of different examples. So you have, how do you pronounce Savioke?
Savioke, yeah.
Savioke, which is a robot delivery service. You have Blue Bottle Coffee when they launched their website. Flatiron Health, which does cancer treatments and matching up cancer studies with eligible patients. And then I think everybody's favorite is going to be Slack because we all love it so much. So could you tell us a little bit about kind of the whole Slack inspiration?
Yeah, a little bit about that sprint. So the big story behind our sprint with Slack was that they were trying to find new ways to explain what Slack is. You guys are, tech savvy. You're right in the target market who already knows what Slack is, or it's easy to explain it to you. But they want to reach beyond that audience, and figuring out how to explain what Slack is and what the benefits of using it might be to someone who's working in a sort of a non-traditionally tech field was challenging. And they had two big ideas about how to do it. They had a sort of a traditional approach, and then they had, if you guys know Stuart Butterfield, who founded Slack, also founded Flickr, and he's just kind of known for having really good product hunches. And he had this hunch about a solution for explaining Slack to new customers, and it would have been really complicated to build. It involved these sort of bots, like chat bots that would be sort of with limited artificial intelligence, but it would be like you were working on a team with Slack. And so in the sprint, we tested those two ideas.
And it turned out that the traditional demo was what worked best for explaining to people who had never used it before.
Yeah, I mean, not to throw Stuart under the bus, but it did turn out that he was wrong. And they found out really fast. Like, they found out in 5 days instead of after months of engineering.
So one of the things that I love about the sprint process is that it allows you to take out a lot of the pain of the brainstorming process, the decision-making process. How did you decide on incorporating the elements that you did to try to minimize that whole element of agonizing over whether you should like someone's idea because you like them or all that other stuff?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing has just been a lot of trial and error. And we've done 100 of these sprints at Google Ventures. I did a bunch of sort of, proto sprints before that at Google. And over the years, I think I'm like many people, I think sometimes I sit in meetings and I'm like, oh my God, this is not a good use of time. Or I'm like, oh, this conversation's painful. And I just started to kind of take note of those moments, and I got really attuned to it. When we were running sprints, when I started to feel that pain, I would think, we're not doing it this way again, this isn't right. And so we just kept experimenting, kept tweaking it. In my job at GV, I had this unique opportunity to sort of work with a lot of different companies, but not have to charge them for the time. We're investors, so we make money when they make money, and we don't charge them to do a sprint with them. And that means that we could experiment with the process without having to worry about, padding our hours or anything. And it helped us focus on just being efficient, just, doing the best work in the shortest amount of time. So those are some of the things that kind of led to it.
And a lot of the ways that you incorporate, so there are a lot of tools that are used in the sprint process. You use a lot of note cards, Post-it notes, whiteboards, stickers, stuff like that. It almost seems like a real-world representation of a digital exchange of ideas. So that way you're minimizing it's Bob presenting the idea, and instead it's let's judge all the ideas by their merit and not by who's presenting them.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a couple important things. One is that I'm a big office supply nerd, so that's true. And I actually think that not only is it a good idea to start on paper, not to start with a fancy digital tool, but the kind of paper, the color of the sticky notes, those things it actually matters.
There's like a legit shopping list at the back of the book that includes my favorite is the stickers. Why pink stickers?
Well, I mean, they don't have to be pink. If you have a violent reaction to pink, they could be orange. But it is important that they, we talk about.
They grab your eye.
Yeah, 1/4 inch and 3/4 inch for different things. We tried to make the book very, very specific so that you wouldn't have to wonder. And we've actually found that a lot of times those little differences, they matter. But the reason why paper and capturing things in a physical way is important, and part of the reason why a lot of the steps of the sprint end up working so well is that we're just, as human beings, we have some glitches and some shortcomings. We're pretty amazing. I don't want to, give you the wrong impression. I think humans are good, but there's a lot of things that we're not really optimized for working in an office setting. We're kind of optimized for a savanna hunting and gathering kind of setting. And when you work with a team for a week, you can't remember everything that everybody said. So you gotta capture that. You gotta put it on paper. You gotta put it on the wall.
That's something that you bring up, is that we actually have limited amounts of abilities to make decisions. And so the way that you structure the week of the sprint is that Monday you line up what the problems are. Tuesday, you kind of constructively work at addressing those problems. Wednesday, you prioritize which solutions you're going to use. Thursday, you build a prototype. And the prototype is, I think, what you guys are going to find the most interesting. And then Friday, you actually gauge the feedback of the ideal person that you're trying to target and use that and actually evaluate what you're going to do out of that.
Yeah, and that limited decision making, it's like, if you guys have ever had the experience of being in a shopping mall and being like, oh my God, I just need to sit down and have a pretzel and a coffee and just chill out. That's when you're in a meeting and you have to make decision after decision after decision, it's fatiguing. You can't make good decisions past a certain point. So in the sprint, we're really careful about limiting which decisions you actually have to make, making those really count, and then allowing competing ideas to stay alive, even prototyping 2 or 3 different approaches and testing them with target customers at the end. So you actually get data. You don't just conjecture about what's going to work.
And going into the sprint, so it's interesting that you're into a very small group size, and each person has a very specific role. Obviously, I'm sure you came up with the process. How did you decide what was the ideal number of people to include?
The hard way, by doing it wrong. The first sprint that I ever ran, the first thing that I called a design sprint in 2010, I had 40 people. And it turns out that it's just crazy. You cannot listen to 40 people explain their idea or talk, it's nuts. But by the same token, you can have a group that's too small or too sort of homogenous. So if you have a team and it's 3 people and they're all designers or they're all product managers or they're all engineers, you're not going to come up with as strong of a solution. You're not going to have that sort of dynamic and positive tension that comes between people with different perspectives, and you're not going to get the benefit of the expertise and knowledge that all the people on your team might have. So it turns out you want to have 4, 5, 6, 7's kind of the max people, so that you have those different viewpoints, you have that different knowledge, and you end up with competing ideas, not just everybody echo chambering each other.
I think that everyone here is going to really love the sprint idea, but one of the things I think they're really going to love about it is the fact that you're a big fan of starting at 10 a.m. and stopping at 5. And like, why is that? It's kind of keeping the sprint limited in time.
Well, it's not because I'm a slacker, for sure, or it might be partly because I'm a slacker. No, I actually think that when in a sprint where you're asking a lot of your team, you're asking them to clear their schedule, stop the work that they're normally doing for a week, and just solve this one big problem. And that's a big request. And you're also asking them within any given day to make a lot of decisions, do a lot of heavy lifting, mentally speaking, and you can't do that productively beyond like 4, 5, 6 hours. Like if people there are certainly cases where people work long, hard hours at startups, and I question whether that's actually like those are full productive days. Because what we have found is that if you're very efficient with your time, that you don't need more than 4, 5, or 6 hours. The extra hours just become more time discussing the same things, it's just diminishing returns. And we want people by the end of the week to still have enough energy to build that prototype on Thursday, it takes a lot of focus to get that done, and to be able to pay attention to their customers on Friday.
And speaking of the limited hours, you are not a fan of including devices in the process.
Yeah, so I am a sucker for anything that's on the internet. I mean, I'll read anything instead of doing my work. And I'm sure that, probably like me, you guys have had the experience of being in a meeting, and either yourself or someone else checks their phone or checks their laptop, and perhaps with good intentions, perhaps meaning to check a document that's pertinent to the discussion at hand. But it's all too easy to get lost in your email, to get lost in Instagram or Facebook or whatever. So during the sprint, we actually have like laptops off, phones away, and we encourage people to, if they need to check their email or do something that requires a computer, just step out of the room and do it. But it's pretty amazing what happens when all those devices are put away and you're just all focusing on the same thing. It actually makes the time spent more efficient because there's no sort of excuse that like, well, I could get something done and listen and participate. When that happens, the pressure to get things done just goes away.
And so you start out with a problem on Monday, you get a bunch of ideas, and by Thursday you're building a prototype. The idea for the prototype is it has to be believable. And what is that threshold for believability, and why is that so important to you?
I think that there's a idea about, maybe it comes from design thinking, or maybe it's just because it's easy, but there's this popular notion that you can test a wireframe or a sketch or a paper prototype, something like a hand drawing, and that you're going to get good data, that you're actually going to learn something worthwhile from your customers by showing them that stuff. And what we found is that if you show someone something that does not appear to be real, that you'll get feedback from them. You'll see them switch into a mode where they're collaborating with you and like, oh, okay, you're really creative. You drew this whole thing out. Yeah, let's talk about your idea. And all of a sudden you're talking to a kid who made like macaroni art. You're not talking about it like it's a serious thing. Yeah. And what we want instead is we want to show people something that's so realistic that they forget that they're looking at a prototype, and all of a sudden they're just reacting to this thing. They're touching this app, and it behaves like they would expect an app to behave. It appears, it's mocked up in the App Store. It looks like it's real, or they're interacting with this robot at their door, and it like really everything appears to be operating, even if there's a person around the corner with a remote control. And that reaction, the difference between a reaction and like collaborative feedback, is super important to whether you can trust the data.
I think that the robot example is a really interesting one because it is such a stressful prototype to build, right? A website, an app is pretty easy to kind of fudge your way through, but with the robot, you literally had this device and you had to attach an iPad screen to it. You had a PlayStation controller. You had a lot of gears and things in motion.
Yeah, and it was kind of, it sounds crazy, and I think that one of the skepticisms people have about the sprint process is like, well, sure, for like a website, but how would that work for, insert the complicated thing? And what happens is if it's your complicated thing, you know how to prototype it. Whether you realize it or not, you know how. You have the expertise. And the robot story is a perfect example. If you had come to me before we worked with Savioke and said, Jake, how are you going to prototype this robot? I would have been like, I have no freaking idea. Like, I don't know how to drive a robot with a remote control, or I don't know all those things. I don't know how to make a soundtrack for a robot. But it turns out that a company that's building a robot does know how to do those things. They do have people on the team who can, on a Thursday, do their part of the prototype and make it appear realistic. And so, yeah, if you put on this sort of prototype mindset, if you kind of like pull down that visor and try to think of how to make a facade, there's kind of always a way.
And there are examples in your book that can relate to things that we do here at WeWork. Like there's the family medical care facility, the name of which I am blanking on right now.
Yeah, One Medical.
Yes, One Medical. And you talked about how they typically are servicing young professionals, but then you wanted them, they used a sprint process to look at tackling families and the insights that they gained from using their existing space and doing a sprint process, testing it out for families.
Right, yeah, and for them, the way that the prototype took shape was that they took one of their existing offices, and they wanted to, they mostly have adult clients, and they wanted to start serving families, kids. So to test that, they took, for one night, they shut the office, they set it up how they hypothesized it should work if they were treating kids with toys out and sort of a different setup in the exam room. And then they brought in 5 families and they kind of like saw what happened. Like what happens if we fast forward into that future and like let people run wild. But if the thing appears realistic, you learn. And they found out, the desk in the doctor's office, which is really nice if you're an adult because you sit down and it's this very like casual way to talk to your doctor. You're not sitting on that weird bed with like the crinkly paper under your bare legs. And not to get too personal, but like when you have a kid in a room with that desk, all of a sudden it's like pandemonium. Like the kid gets into something, the doctor's like, there's this obstacle that everybody's like trying to get around. And, they would never have known that in advance. They might have rolled out a bunch of these offices, but you can test it really quick.
And we have people on staff who are really talented artists. We have people on staff who are not artists. Sprint allows you to kind of democratize ideas. So the folks that are involved in a sprint, basically there are some graphic elements, but it's not about drawing. It's not necessarily about visually representing your ideas. It's about actually putting them in the framework that you put together so people can actually visualize that.
Yeah, it's all too common on teams to silo who makes things or who designs things or who solves sort of the problems into the people who can make things in the right
make them look pretty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, make them look pretty. And so it's, I've worked on plenty of teams where like the designer's in charge of figuring out how this looks because the designer knows how to use Photoshop or Sketch or insert the thing. And the truth is that everyone has the capacity to come up with those kinds of solutions, the solutions that involve figuring out how this thing should look and work. It's not, it doesn't necessarily require a bunch of sophisticated human-computer interface or whatever kinds of skills, but most people don't know how to approach it. They're intimidated by tools like Photoshop, and if you just give everyone paper and you give them like sort of a specific set of steps, first we're going to do this, then this, and then this, everybody's on the same playing field. Everyone can make something that has a lot of detail that everyone can interpret as a sort of complete solution. And then it gets really interesting. You get to find out what the non-designers, the non-product people think should happen, and often those are the best ideas.
And you also have a part of the sprint process called Ask the Expert, which is interesting because you'll have your core group in the room, but then you'll bring in people who are experts in different fields to kind of share their insights on that problem that's being tackled by the process. So in the case of Blue Bottle Coffee, you'd bring in people that were involved with the actual coffee process to kind of advise, and they would come in, share their expertise, and then leave. Like, what was the idea that kind of went into that?
Well, we noticed that there were people who had information on teams who weren't necessarily sharing that information at the perfect time. So you can imagine you start a sprint and you get into day 2 or something and somebody says, oh, if only we had talked to Jane from, whatever, like business development, finance, accounting. Yeah, like Jane totally knows this part of it. And we're like, oh God, like it's kind of too late now. So we realized that what you need to do is survey the whole team, figure out who are all the people who have interesting information on the team, and let's get it all out on the table at once. Because you have conversations with people on your team, but it's rarely all at the right time, all right before you're going to try to solve the problem. And doing it at the right time turns out to be really important for getting great solutions.
And I like that you never call out anybody who flubbed anything up by name. So we do have examples in the book of examples of sprints gone wrong. Sometimes it's because they didn't include the right people in the Ask the Expert process, but they're usually referred to with pseudonyms.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is, and I do in the book talk about a lot of mistakes. The reality is that the mistakes are truly my mistakes. They're not, they're mistakes in the process. Because if you run the process in the right way, and what we have found over time is the right way, you'll avoid almost all of the potential pitfalls. There are things like you forget to include the right person, or you have too many people or not enough.
Decision makers are very important.
Yeah, one of the things that's crucial in the sprint is having the decision maker in the room to make the call. We don't want the group to decide democratically. We actually want this sort of opinionated, unilateral decision about which ideas to test. We think that's the way the best ideas come out, and also the way you make sure that a pet idea doesn't get missed.
And the decision maker has to be honest with themselves as well, because there's an example in your book of a decision maker who was like, yeah, we'll do this, and then a couple weeks later they're like, no, I'm not feeling it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a collegial atmosphere that can develop in any time a group is working together, and so the decision maker has to be really frank about what they believe.
So we've kind of done a quick overview of the process, and I do want to open this up to questions because I know how many people are dying to talk to you. So Monday you start off with a problem. Tuesday you kind of get ideas together. Wednesday you move forward and kind of prototype and identify the key points of addressing the real problem. Thursday you build the prototype, and then Friday what's really interesting is your feedback process. So you believe in finding relevant people to help you test a prototype using Craigslist. Can you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Craigslist most of the time. I should disclaimer that a little bit, but so everybody knows that having a lot of data is good. Like if you have a lot of data and you can analyze it, if you can launch your product and A/B test it, or analyze a giant market of people, that's if you have that information, it will probably help you. But what fewer people know is that you can learn a lot from 5 customers. If you talk to 5 customers one-on-one, you'll figure out things that you can never or almost never find out from big numbers of data, which is why. Why does this solution work or not work? Why do people understand this or not understand it? And a lot of sort of unfortunate and unpleasant and long debates that happen on teams and at companies happen when people are trying to interpret what that data means and they have different opinions about it. So on Friday, you interview those 5 people, but it's really important that you have the right 5 people. They have to really represent your target customer. And in order to do that, you've got to screen people out. So we ask people to, in the sprint, either, if you've got a sort of an expert user, an expert customer, then you probably can't recruit them on Craigslist. But in most cases, for most kind of consumer products, you post an ad on Craigslist, you get like 300 responses, and you ask them to fill out a survey. And then as you go through that survey results, you're able to identify the people who match your customer.
And the 5 people, or the sample size that you're getting the data from, they are being given a lot of time to kind of complete sort of an interview. And you have this interviewer, Michael, and he was a really interesting figure because he helps put the person at ease and walk them through the prototype. And the other team that's part of the sprint is watching the feedback session in real time. So they can't misinterpret the data later. They're all experiencing it together and like taking notes on it together.
Yeah, and that's really important to be there together, because research that's done by one person and then explained to the rest of the team, it really relies a lot on the researcher to be able to make a compelling case for what they saw, and it's also a lot of work to put that together. So it's very powerful to have the whole team watch, to have the whole team take notes, and then you have no lag. At the end of the day on Friday, there's clarity about what to do next and about which ideas worked and which ones need more work.
I thought it was amazing. And so I'm going to open it up to questions. We have a mic in the middle of the room. If anybody wants to come up and ask a totally awesome question.
Or even a super lame question. That'd be fine too.
Quick question. Hi, I'm Cash. I'm an architect here at WeWork. I was wondering, could you say a little bit more about Google Ventures, what that is, as opposed to Google, I guess?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and actually, we're not even Google Ventures anymore. We're GV now as part of the whole Alphabet thing. But we're one, if you guys have heard of Alphabet, the Alphabet reorg, we're one of the things that's not Google, but is part of Alphabet. And Google Ventures is a venture fund. So we invest in startups. We invest, I think our budget now is like $425 million a year in startups, and we've invested in over 300 different companies. So there's companies that you might have heard of, like Slack or Uber and Nest, but many of them are small seed companies and a lot of healthcare, life science companies. And one of the things that's unique about GV is that we have a big design team. Well, big. I mean, there's 6 of us, but we have a hypothesis that helping our companies with design and effectively helping them bridge the gap between their vision for the product and how customers will understand and make it fit into their lives. That there's a gap there, and if you can help people cross that gap, you'll increase your financial returns if you're a venture fund. So that's sort of our big bet, and that's a big reason why the sprint process exists.
Hi there, Ty. So you had mentioned earlier some of the design thinking principles, and it seems like you're using this kind of diverging, ideating, and then converging principles in Sprint. Can you talk to me about how different team sizes might affect how well the Sprint runs on perhaps different days, or what you found is the ideal team size?
Yeah, so the ideal team size, it turns out, is 7. 7 people is like perfect. You've got a lot of diversity of skills you can have if you have 7 people, but you don't start to get the drag that happens when you've got, you can imagine if you have 10, 12, 15 people, you start to have a lot of different solutions to talk about, a lot of voices to hear. It's possible to run this process. In fact, I've even talked to a guy who by himself ran a sprint, and you can do all the steps and actually gain benefit from it. But a lot of the value comes from having those different people in the room working together. So I really think it goes best if you've got 4 at least. And most of the reason why I believe those numbers are right just comes from making mistakes, going too low, or more commonly going too high. You asked about different days of the week, though, and on Monday you can have more people involved. So you talked about Ask the Experts. We'll bring in people Monday afternoon to give us their take, to tell us everything they know about the problem at hand. And on Friday, if you want, more people can watch the interviews, as long as they're not participating in coming up with solutions and making decisions. That stuff actually becomes unwieldy with a bunch of people. And then the last thing I'll say about it is that on Thursday, sometimes you can narrow down and just have like 1, 2, 3 people actually build the prototype. Depending on what it is, it doesn't always require all hands on deck.
You brought up Ocean's 11 in the book.
Yeah.
Was that perhaps an inspiration for the number?
It wasn't, although, Ocean's 11 is a big inspiration for the process because, I don't know if you guys have watched Ocean's 11, but when I watched that, I was like, I wish my life was like that. That looks awesome. This sounds super corny, but those guys in Ocean's 11, they each have their skill, and during that, what it was like 2 weeks, so it's not exactly like a sprint, but they're each using their skill to its best use to solve this big, crazy problem of robbing the casino, and which of course has to be done. And so what's kind of inspiring about that is that what if work was like that? What if you came to work on a week and you were doing your thing that only you can do with a team of people who were awesome and they're doing the thing that only they can do, and by the end you accomplished this crazy thing. You just focused on this one thing and you got it done, and you all sort of came together and did it. And I know how corny and crazy and cheesy that sounds, but there really is something Ocean's 11 about a sprint. It is the closest you'll come to that in a normal job.
Thank you.
Hey, what's up? My name's Greg.
Nice to meet you, Greg.
I just joined 2 months ago, so I'm on the design team, and we're still trying to figure out our design sprint process. So
I know a book.
Good timing.
Yeah.
But I have so many questions. It's hard for me to pick one out. Because we're going through these process and we're doing user studies, and all that takes time. Like,
Yeah.
is this sprint every week, or are these special
No,
case
no, no.
sprints?
Yeah. Great question. I don't think for almost all teams it's not something to do every week, because you would probably go insane. Like it is, because
Yeah.
it's intense.
It's exhausting.
It's not so exhausting. I mean, in a normal year, I do like 25, 35 sprints. So you can do a lot of them and not get exhausted, but then I don't have to like execute on stuff afterwards. So what you really have to do is have a way that you execute that you're eventually shifting back into. A frequent pattern that we see is that a company would do one sprint. The second week, they'll do an abbreviated sprint because they're just fixing things that they found in the first one. It doesn't take the whole week to do that, but you are running another test. Sometimes they'll run a third sprint that's mostly just prototyping, making that prototype more robust and testing it. And when you've done 2-3 sprints like that, then you can go back into execution mode with a lot of confidence that you're on the right path. A lot of companies will do a sprint like once a quarter when a big thing comes along. We need to sanity check this idea that's about to launch, or we need to kick off this new thing in a strong way. Sprint's great for that, but there are a few teams who adapt this into like a thing that they do almost all the time. I don't think that's necessarily for everyone, but what you can do is get into a regular cadence of research, and it's actually kind of counterintuitively easier to do research on a regular basis than it is to do once in a while. It's kind of like it's easier to brush your teeth, every night than it is to do it like once a week, which I don't recommend. And so if you're doing research regularly, you'll know how to find customers. That'll be kind of an automatic pilot. You'll know how to screen them. You might even have like an interview guide. Somebody on your team who does the interviews will be like, yeah, this is no big deal. I'll just do it. It doesn't feel like the stressful thing. So those actually benefit from repetition and frequency.
Awesome. Thank you for that. My other question, I'll keep it to 2. Sorry, guys. Is to the Friday session, finding, scheduling, getting the questionnaire. How do you do that all in one day? Like, because that seems crazy to me. Because like, don't people have plans? Like, or just I don't know how that works.
Do you mean how do you get 5 people to show up, or how do you do all the work to get them?
Yeah, logistically. Like,
logistics, yeah.
We did a user test all across the entire city. We were running from place to place. It took 2 days. So
yeah, okay.
How do you like?
So if you are there's a couple pieces in there. I think one is how do you get all of the recruiting done during the sprint week, and one person needs to be in charge of that. And that is work that does happen outside of the sprint week. So you talked about the hours that we work. We generally work like 10 to 5. We take an hour off for lunch. We take breaks in between. The person who's in charge of recruiting will often be doing, 2 to 4, sometimes even 6 hours of extra work that happens either before or after the sprint. Or the way we often do it on our team is we've got somebody who's not in the sprint who runs the research. They just are doing that during the regular daytime hours, and then on Friday they run the test. So you could do it either of those 2 ways, but it is extra work. Now the other part is like how do you fit in 5 studies in one day? And really the only way you can fit them all in one day is if you have people come to you and you do it at your office, or you do them over video. You project or screen share with them, or put your prototype on the web, whatever it is, so that you can watch them do it.
I mean, off of that though, like, what if part of your prototype is testing it in the field?
Yeah. So, and that is frequently the case. You have to test it in the field, and in that case, you get a hall pass. You don't have to do the whole test on Friday. You can split it up over Friday and Monday and Tuesday or whatever. Yeah, it's a 7-day sprint. Yeah. Now, what you don't want to do is you only want to do that if you absolutely can't do it the other way, because there are costs to spreading it out over 2 weeks. It's harder to keep a team together watching all those studies when they're not all in the same week. There's a continuity loss that happens on the weekend. Part of the reason why I do the sprint in 5 days is because you don't start to lose things out of your short-term memory. You don't have that weekend gap. So there's a cost to doing it that way, but if you have to be on site, you have to be on site.
Hi, Benjamin. I work with Tomer Sharon on the UX team. says hi.
Oh, right on.
Can you talk about what you've learned about the optimal space to run a sprint and
Yeah.
like what the room looks like?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So this has actually been really surprising to me. Over time, I visited a lot of companies, big and small, and very few companies have a good space to solve these kinds of problems. Companies typically have conference rooms with tables and like a monitor on the wall at one end. They often don't have whiteboards. I mean, I look around at the conference rooms here. Actually, you guys are in really good shape, but there's really honestly, when was the last time you really needed a table in a meeting room? Like, do you really need a table? Like, it's almost never. Like, maybe if you're having like a birthday cake in there or something, but it's sort of a vestige, I think, of a bygone era. And so the perfect room for a sprint has flexible furniture so that you can move stuff out of the way, and you're actually having a conversation like we are, not kind of in a board meeting. And but that's not critical. What is critical is having whiteboards, having stuff on the wall that you can write on and leave up, and you'll be able to write some stuff on Monday, and you won't have to just remember it the rest of the week. So if you don't have a room that has whiteboards, you can bring in rolling whiteboards. You can even use butcher paper, but you have to get some surface area to stick stuff on. That's the most crucial thing. And you also want to make sure, if at all possible, that you're not bouncing around from day to day. It's really ideal to have the same room all 5 days, so you just leave stuff up on the wall. You're not worrying about it. We have a lot of spatial memory as humans. Like, we're pretty good at figuring out and remembering where things are geographically in 3 dimensions. And when you're in the same room, you start to benefit from that. You'll know, oh yeah, I don't have to remember the list of all of our customer types because it's over there somewhere. I don't have to remember what that sketch for that solution looks like because it's over there somewhere. And when you're in the same room, you can benefit from that. You can build on that capability. When you bounce around, it's hard. It actually it's not something you'll consciously, probably scratch your head about, but there's a sort of subconscious pain that happens every time you try to remember.
I think you'll get a kick out of the fact that conference room in the corner is literally entirely whiteboard. Like, every single wall is, you can draw on it.
That's perfect. You cannot have too much whiteboard. If you guys when you guys are setting up your own space, just no tables, lots of whiteboards. Spend the money on the tables on whiteboards instead. It's my big tip.
My name's Will. I was curious, you mentioned a little bit about moving from this kind of sprint and prototyping phase into execution. And what does that kind of look like? Are the people in these sprints the same people that will go out and execute, or is it a substitute and there's a handoff to a larger team, or how does that kind of transition work from idea generating to execution?
Oh, sorry, could you repeat the last?
From idea generating to idea execution.
Ideally, it is the same team, or at least a subset of the same team that's executing. I think that it's a mistake on any team to have the problem-solving team and then the execution team be different kinds of people, because I don't want to be on the execution team and not get to pick what we're working on. That sounds like it sucks. Although I think it is okay if there's just a representative from that team in the sprint. You don't want to, in the interest of having the exact same team execute as is in the sprint, have 35 people in the sprint. But basically what you want to do is you do the sprint, you get to the point where you've got confidence in the prototype, you've tested it, and you're like, yeah, this is the way to go. We want to build this, and then that handoff is just it varies from team to team. I'm sort of not super opinionated about what the best way to execute is, because I've seen different teams work differently and have good results, build high quality products, high quality services. So you can do that with Agile, you can do that. I mean, you can even, some people do that with Waterfall, they come up with good stuff. But what's important is that you sort of carry forward that proven idea from the sprint, that there are people who were in the sprint who are working on it still, so it's not handed down from above or whatever, from this other weird research team to the product team. And I think it's also important that you keep some kind of a rhythm of testing with customers even as you continue to build, because there are always a lot more decisions to be made further downstream as you go, and you want to continue to validate those and keep that closeness to your customers that comes from doing a sprint.
Thanks.
Hey, how you doing? So a lot of these, the things you're talking about, sound really great for things that involve, user interaction, things that involve design. I'm a DevOps, so what about things that are really back-end heavy, that are really, really technical, maybe involve some sort of, machine learning thing where I'm not even sure what that means to have like user interaction on Friday. How does this sprint work for really technical things?
I'll give you an abstract answer that might not be satisfying, and then I'll give you 2 examples that also might not be satisfying, but maybe between the 3, there's something. So the abstract answer is that what you can do in a sprint really well, really effectively, it's designed to do, is to test the point where your product or service, whatever shape it takes, encounters humans. So the sort of underlying idea is that humans are the riskiest part of any endeavor. You don't know how they're going to react. It's very hard to predict us as a species, and so you want to, as quickly as you can, get to a facade of that touch point, that interaction place between human and idea, and then figure out where might the holes be, where might there be flaws. So if what you're building is more back end, if there's a big bet on technology, you have to figure out how to test it. The question is like, well, where does it meet humans? And I'll give you a couple of examples, and I don't know if they'll ring true or if they'll feel a little too consumery to you, but the first one involves machine learning. So one of the projects that I worked on that actually inspired a lot of my thinking about sprints and about what you can do in a week was priority inbox on Gmail. So this is a feature that it's machine learning. It analyzes what you read, what you click on, the way you interact with your email, you personally as an individual, and it creates a model of what it predicts you'll find important, the mail that you'll find important and the mail that is maybe less important to you. And when I was working on that project, the biggest question, the hardest work to do by far, was the machine learning that would actually deliver those results. That was a project that we knew going into it was 12, 18, 24 months of work to make it, to get it at a high enough quality. The team was fairly confident that they could do it, but they weren't 100% sure, so a lot of the risk was technical risk. Could this actually be done? And a small part of it was how it shows up in your inbox. Like, will people be able to make sense of some kind of categorization that happens over the top? And in order to test it, our prototypes, and this was sort of pre-sprint, but they were week-long prototypes, were hacked version. We would hack the front end of Gmail so that for a limited number of users, we could show them their email with a very rudimentary version of this machine learning-based scoring that would sort their email into chunks, and we were experimenting with different interfaces for it. Now, it turns out that framework of prototyping the front end also created this forcing factor for the engineers to prototype the machine learning. And it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it would ultimately become, but that frame helped them make quick progress. And it also turned out that understanding what kinds of groupings and categorizations happened in the inbox helped them understand what was meaningful work to do on the back end and what maybe didn't matter to people. So that's possibly satisfying or unsatisfying example A. Example B is a project we did with Nest, who's the company who makes like thermostats and other home devices. And for them, we were working on an API, working together with them on an API. And so, again, like the bulk of the work for them was this API development. It wasn't something that most people will ever see, but most of the questions we had about how it should work involved when developers are making the decision whether to use this API or not. Will they be able to understand how it works? Will it make sense to them? Will it have features that are compelling? And that was something we could test by prototyping the API. The page you go to with the API like describes it, the sort of the toolkit, the examples. That was something that was doable in a day. We could prototype what that looked like, and we could find out a lot about how it might work and where the questions were. But again, it involved that like human product interaction point. So if you can find, I'll wind this up now. If you can find that point where the humans touch it. That's a great way to sprint, and it should be pretty easy to find out how to apply this. If you can't, you might benefit from the other steps, the sharing information and making a map on day one, the sort of individual detailed problem solving on day two, the structured decision making on day three, and maybe the way you prototype and test is something different, something that doesn't touch customers, but those other steps still really help any team.
Can I get one more question?
Yeah, sure.
So the other thing is, the team, you said you have a team of 7, and sort of I assume that at least with Google Ventures, you're working with either teams that already know how to work really well together, or really young teams, but they're full of, piss and vinegar. What about if you have teams that you have juniors on there who aren't necessarily like really experienced just in doing regular product development? How do you only have like the cream of the crop who are working on a sprint? Like, is there like your like special ops team who are going to be doing this, or is it involve anyone?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So we definitely get to work with some awesome companies, some awesome teams. However, I think there's a common like attribution error or something that people make, which they think that like other people are super competent, but we're not. Like, but those other people, they know what they're doing, but like we don't. In reality, like most teams, I can't think of the team that functions perfectly well. And I can't think of the team that doesn't have people on it who are new to their role or less experienced, or people who are new to the company, and the team, there's very few teams that have been working together doing the same thing for years and years and years, and it's just like a Swiss watch. So a sprint, one of the nice things about the sprint is that in many cases, in our experience, we have worked with teams where there's new people, there's new products, not everybody knows what they're doing. And one of the great things about the sprint is that it takes away a lot of the guesswork about how your team should work together. You don't have to figure out how you should make decisions. You don't have to figure out how you should sort of share information. All those things that like you're not consciously doing in a meeting, but we are doing every time we meet, every time we talk with a colleague at their desk. We're sort of figuring out like how do we make progress here. And you don't have to do that stuff. You just get to focus on the problem. So in a way, it's actually a great thing for a forming team or a young team and an experienced team, because it's a best practice that you can follow, and you don't have to worry about some of that tricky stuff that requires experience.
And just to kind of add on to that, the facilitator of the sprint actually works really hard, because a big part of their job is to kind of deal with all of the social basically the structuring of the day and of the sprint to help alleviate that social tension and any sort of like, oh, I'm working with this other person from this other department. It's like you don't even think about that. The facilitator structures the day in such a way that you're able to focus entirely on the work at hand.
Yeah, and to make the facilitator's job as easy as possible, not to sound like an advertisement, but the book at the end has a checklist, just like day by day, hour by hour, what you do in order to get you can be sure if you follow that checklist, you'll get everything done, and you won't have these big like sort of freak out moments that can be super stressful. So we've tried to take the guesswork out.
Where you're like, put the pencil down, and nobody wants to do that.
Right.
Hello again. So what can we do to reduce the barrier of entry for starting a sprint? It seems really like this big thing to like find all of these experts and find all of these UX people and to actually speak on a subject that I don't feel comfortable speaking about. What can we do to make that easier for people?
So although we call that step, ask the experts, and although we like to talk a lot about prototyping, and many of the examples that we use are prototypes that involve designers, or they're using some design tools. It's actually the case that you don't need anyone who's not already on your team. So the sprint is best thought of as a booster rocket for your existing work. You're going to be doing the same stuff that would be working on anyway. You're going to be solving the same problem. It's just a really important problem, but it's one that's already on your plate, on your radar. It's not some brand new thing. If you know outside people that you want to bring in, that's great, but 95% of our sprints just involve the people who are in the room already intact on the team. And to can address the idea of like whether you need sort of design experts. I think it's a good idea to have a designer on any team that's making stuff that people use, but you don't need any extra design help. You don't need anything extra above and beyond. And in fact, a lot of the prototypes that we build, and I talk a lot about this in the book, the prototypes are built with PowerPoint or Keynote, which are tools that are very approachable by anyone. They're not something you need special skills in order to use. So it shouldn't take anything special, and it shouldn't, like the biggest barrier should be, do we have a project that's important enough that we're willing to clear a week to work on it? If you don't have a project that has questions around it, then just wait, you will. And if you do have a really important project and you're feeling stuck or you wonder what the right way to start is, but you can't clear a week, then I think there's a big question about like, it's, well, shouldn't you? Like, isn't it worth spending a week to maybe save months later? So, yeah, don't worry about it. Like, just do it. It's kind of the bottom line advice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
James.
Let me bring this down. I'm kind of short. Boop. There we go. James, research and development. I have a quick. I don't know. I came in a little late. I apologize if you've already kind of.
I'm super offended, but that's fine.
But I have a question as like, if you have these big initiatives that you're already in the middle of, and here we're hiring aggressively. Do you have any advice to bring new people kind of up to speed within this sprint format?
Well, actually, the sprint turns out to be I hate to always say like, gosh, the sprint is a great thing for that thing you're talking about, but a sprint is an awesome way to bring someone up to speed, because part of what happens, especially on day one, is kind of a like, okay, let's share the stuff that we take for granted, we all agree upon. Let's actually like write down what our goal is. Let's list our customers. Let's make a map of how this all fits together. And on most of the time, we just assume that our colleagues share the same image in their head of where we're going and what it's going to look like when we get there. And what often happens is when you start to write that stuff on the board and just do these things that seem elementary, they actually are, sometimes controversial, or at least there's gaps in what people understand. And it actually takes everyone's knowledge to fill those pieces in. So that backing up and making sure you've got all the bases covered is the perfect way for a new person to understand how the product is thought about, how the team works together, who has what expertise, who should I talk to about this. It's also a chance for them to get to participate, jump right in and participate in a way that their contribution of ideas is a natural part, an expected part of the process. So they don't have to feel shy or uncomfortable about throwing in their ideas. It will just be a matter of course that they will. And we've on many occasions had, because startups are also growing fast, and they'll have a new person joining just this week. And every time I hear afterwards, like, oh my gosh, that was the perfect way to get started with this company. I'm so glad the timing worked out. So definitely don't wait until everybody's already up to speed. You can just have them jump right in.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I haven't mentioned that to anyone except you, but we are going to have like a sprint week in towards the end of March. I think it's the week of March 22nd. So we're going to encourage teams everywhere to run a sprint the same week. So if you have any, hesitancy to run a sprint, that's a great week to do it, because people all around the country will be screwing it up at the same time as you. You won't be alone. And we'll also be kind of sharing like a video each day that kind of talks about here's what goes on today, here's what to expect, and everybody will be sort of in it together. So that's one way to take the plunge.
Last question.
Can you talk about your experience writing the book? Like, how was it coming up with this concept? Why did you decide to write the book? And even after, like, now, like, how is it going around talking to people about your book?
Yeah, it's
as somebody who's never written a book before.
it's super weird, but yeah. So basically, what happened was, started doing these sprints at Google, and I got this job at Google Ventures, and I thought, this is the last question, so you're going to get a little bit of a story here. You guys feel free to depart whenever you get bored. But I was reading Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about this like idea of getting like 10,000 hours of practice at something, and these people or these teams who had these weird opportunities to get a lot of practice. So he talks about Bill Gates getting a lot of practice using a computer because he had this weird opportunity in high school. And he talks about the Beatles getting this weird opportunity to practice together a lot in these concerts they would do in Germany in these sort of like little taverns. And when the opportunity came along to go to Google Ventures, I wasn't interested in startups, but I thought, here's an opportunity to like share what I'm doing publicly, because at GV they talked publicly, which wasn't something we did at Google. And it's also an opportunity to work with a ton of companies and with a really strong team who's going to push the process along. So that was why I went to GV, and immediately as soon as we started blogging about sprints, we started to hear back from people who were running sprints, and they were like, I had, up till then, honestly, I had kind of hoped that I was like the magic ingredient that made this process work. So I had mixed feelings. I was like, I'm glad you read the blog post and you did it on your own, but I'm kind of sad that you were able to do it on your own without me. But it became clear that I wasn't crucial, and that the process could work. Like, people could read about it and do it. But they had a lot of questions. So people asked, they asked for more detail about what happens each day. They asked for stories, like what does this look like in practice? People wanted to know why we did some of the things that we did on different days. And over time, over the next couple of years, the process continued to improve because it was in this Outliers, like Beatles in Germany, like kind of sort of just crazy situation where we were doing 20, 30 sprints a year with all these different kinds of companies. And when we got to the point where we were consistently running the same method, it was working well. It didn't mean that every week we came up with a winning solution, but we learned every week. Every time we were able to learn, no matter what the product was, no matter who the customers were. Then we realized, like, okay, it's time to update those posts, and maybe we should just like go all in and write a book. Like, what would that look like? So following my own advice, sort of reluctantly, I cleared a week and made a prototype of the book. I took the blog posts, I wrote some narrative about the sprint with Blue Bottle Coffee, some tiny scraps of which are actually made it to the final version of the book, but most of it was stuff that ended up being thrown away. I illustrated it. The book has illustrations. I drew some drawings, none of which made it. But you could kind of see what a realistic first 30 pages of the book would look like. The table of contents, I made a really crappy cover, printed it out, wrapped it around a hardcover book, and I tested it on some people who I thought were sort of target customer. Like, I sent them the PDF, so what do you think about this? And both the act, just like in a real sprint, it was interesting to hear from people, and also part of the learning came from doing it, having a real thing, and seeing for myself. One of the things you learn in a sprint is you see, like, oh, this is what a finished thing would look like. We don't have to talk about it abstractly anymore. This is how it would feel to be holding this thing. So anyway, at that point, I decided to do it. I talked my colleagues into working on it with me. And over the course of the last year, actually, Ben, my editor, Sylvie, my agent, are here. They helped me write it tremendously. Writing a book definitely requires lots of help. It's hard. But we did a lot of it in sprints. So a lot of it was a matter of clearing a week. You can just get a lot more done if you can focus on one thing for a week. So we found ways to do that. We tested it with beta readers, did a lot of prototyping, and so that's kind of how we finally got done with it. And then now, this is the very beginning of promoting it, so I don't really know what to tell you about what it's like, but I've done 4 interviews today talking about it, and it's strange. It's definitely strange, It's very fun to talk to people who are solving the same kinds of problems that I'm trying to solve at work, because I can talk to you guys about tech stuff or front-end stuff. A lot of the audience is beyond that. It's folks who are using this for more general business or for even teachers. So I'm learning how to explain it to different audiences, but pretty fun, actually.
And we're so grateful that you came by. And if anybody wants a copy of the book, it's not out yet, but I'm collecting people's names, and we're going to place a mega order for people. So email me at victoria@wework.com to reserve your copy. And thank you, Jake.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. Thanks.